The man's cologne reached her before his voice did, something expensive that smelled like cedar and entitlement. Margaret Holloway didn't look up from her worn canvas bag as she settled into seat 3A, her fingers trembling slightly as she buckled the seatbelt. The leather beneath her was softer than any furniture she'd ever owned. "Excuse me." The voice came with a forced politeness that barely concealed its edge. "I think you might be in the wrong section." Margaret's hands stilled. She was 53 years old, and her knuckles were swollen from 27 years of scrubbing other people's floors. The man standing in the aisle wore a suit that probably cost more than she made in 3 months. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "This is first class," he continued, louder now, as if she might be hard of hearing or slow to understand. A few heads turned. "Economy is toward the back." The flight attendant appeared, her professional smile already in place. "Is there a problem, Mr. Westbrook?" Margaret finally looked up. Her face was plain, lined with the kind of exhaustion that sleep never quite fixed. She wore a discount store blouse that she'd ironed that morning in her efficiency apartment, and her shoes, the nice ones she saved for church, had been resoled twice. "No problem," Margaret said quietly, reaching into her bag. Her heart hammered against her ribs, that old familiar feeling of being watched, judged, found lacking. She'd felt it in grocery stores when she counted out change. In banks, when she asked about loan requirements she knew she'd never meet. In the emergency room, when she couldn't afford the copay. She pulled out the boarding pass and held it up without a word. The flight attendant's eyebrows rose slightly. "Seat 3A. You're exactly where you should be, ma'am." She turned to the man. "Mr. Westbrook, you're in 3C, across the aisle." "That's—" He squinted at Margaret's boarding pass, then laughed, a short, incredulous sound. "Well, you must have gotten extremely lucky with an upgrade. Congratulations." The word dripped with something that wasn't quite congratulations at all. Margaret said nothing. She'd learned long ago that silence was often the safest response. As the man settled into his seat, she heard him mutter to someone on his phone, "You won't believe who they're letting into first class these days." The plane's engines rumbled to life beneath them. Through the oval window, the Detroit Metropolitan Airport stretched out in the late afternoon sun, all concrete and purpose, people going places, doing things, being someone. Margaret pressed her forehead against the cool plastic and closed her eyes. She hadn't told anyone she was leaving, not the supervisor at Clean Sweep Services who'd given her strange looks when she requested emergency leave, not her neighbor Rosa, who sometimes shared beans and rice when Margaret's paycheck ran thin, not even Father Martinez at St. Anne's, though he would have understood better than most. In her bag, beneath the spare underwear and the toothbrush she'd bought at the dollar store, was a letter. She'd read it so many times in the past 48 hours that she'd memorized every word, every loop of the handwriting that was achingly familiar and desperately strange all at once. "Mom, I don't know if you'll come. I don't know if I have any right to ask, but I'm getting married in 3 days, and I can't stop thinking about the last thing you said to me, that you'd always be there when I needed you, even if I didn't think I did. The ticket is first class because I wanted you to feel, just once, like someone was taking care of you instead of the other way around. Please come." Sarah, 12 years. That's how long it had been since Margaret had seen her daughter. 12 years since Sarah had left for college on a full scholarship and slowly, incrementally, drifted into a life that had no room for a mother who cleaned houses and spoke with an accent that marked her as someone who'd never quite belonged. The calls had grown shorter, then further apart, then mostly texts, then silence. And Margaret had let it happen because wasn't that what love sometimes meant? Letting your child fly away, even when it felt like your heart was being pulled out through your throat. The plane began to taxi. Across the aisle, Mr. Westbrook was typing aggressively on his laptop, every keystroke an assertion of importance. 2 rows back, A family was arguing in hushed tones about whether they'd remembered to pack the iPad charger. The flight attendants moved through their safety demonstration with practiced efficiency, pointing out exits that Margaret stared at with the intensity of someone who'd never flown before, because she hadn't. In 53 years, Margaret Holloway had never been on an airplane. She'd grown up in Brownsville, Texas, the daughter of a mechanic and a seamstress who'd crossed the border legally in 1967 with dreams of something better. They'd found work, found community, found enough to get by. Margaret had married young, too young, to a man who'd promised her the world and delivered mostly disappointment and an empty bank account before leaving when Sarah was 3. After that, it had been just the two of them. Margaret and Sarah against the world, scraping by in a one-bedroom apartment where they'd shared a bed until Sarah turned 10 and Margaret had saved enough to buy a used futon. She'd worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, her hands in bleach and ammonia, her back aching from bending and scrubbing and making other people's lives cleaner, while hers stayed stubbornly small. But Sarah, God, Sarah had been brilliant. Teachers had called her gifted. She'd read everything, questioned everything, wanted to know how things worked and why people acted the way they did. Margaret had watched her daughter reach for things she herself had never dared to touch, had encouraged every dream, even as she quietly calculated the cost of each school supply, each field trip, each opportunity. The acceptance letter from Northwestern University had arrived on a Tuesday. Full academic scholarship. Margaret had cried in the bathroom so Sarah wouldn't see, wouldn't feel guilty for wanting more than what their little apartment could hold. "We're going to start our ascent." The flight attendant's voice crackled over the intercom. "Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened." Margaret gripped the armrests as the plane accelerated down the runway. The pressure pushed her back into the seat, and then, impossibly, terrifyingly, the ground fell away. They were flying. She watched Detroit shrink beneath them, the city where she'd moved 15 years ago chasing slightly better pay, slightly better opportunities. The highways looked like veins, the buildings like children's blocks. Everything she knew was down there, getting smaller by the second. When they leveled out above the clouds, the cabin lights dimmed slightly. Mr. Westbrook ordered a scotch, neat. The flight attendant asked Margaret if she'd like anything. "Just water, please," Margaret said, "still or sparkling." Margaret blinked. There were kinds of water. Still is fine. It came in a real glass, not plastic. There were warm nuts in a small bowl. The seat reclined at the touch of a button. Margaret sat very still, afraid to touch anything, afraid to take up more space than she was entitled to. But she'd been afraid before. She'd been afraid when Sarah was born 6 weeks early and the hospital bills had been crushing. Afraid when she'd been laid off from the hotel cleaning job and had to choose between electricity and groceries. Afraid every time Sarah had gotten sick because the clinic charged $50 just to be seen. She'd survived all of that. She could survive this. Through the window, the sky was turning pink and gold. Somewhere ahead in Seattle, Sarah was getting married to someone Margaret had never met, planning a life Margaret knew nothing about, becoming a person Margaret barely recognized from the few photos Sarah posted on social media, always carefully cropped, always carefully curated, rarely including any clues to where she'd come from. The letter was in her bag. The ticket had arrived with it, printed on heavy cardstock. The confirmation number long and official. First class. Sarah had sent her mother a first-class ticket. Margaret didn't know if it was an apology or a bribe, didn't know if she was being invited back in, or if this was closure dressed up as an olive branch. Didn't know if she'd even recognize her own daughter after 12 years of distance and silence, but she was going anyway. She'd sold her mother's wedding ring to pay for the 2 days off work, the only piece of jewelry she'd owned that was worth anything. Had told her supervisor it was a family emergency, which was true enough. Had packed everything she owned that didn't have stains or holes. which fit easily into one bag. And now she was 37,000 feet in the air, sitting in a seat that cost more than her monthly rent, flying toward a daughter who'd once been her whole world and was now a stranger who signed emails, "Best Sarah," when she bothered to reply at all. Mr. Westbrook was watching her. She could feel his gaze, the judgment in it. He saw what everyone saw, a woman who didn't belong, who'd probably made some mistake, who would eventually be found out and sent back to where she came from. What he didn't see was the steel beneath the exhaustion, the determination that had kept Margaret upright through every blow life had delivered, the love that hadn't faded despite the silence, despite the distance, despite the hurt that sat heavy in her chest like a stone she'd learned to carry. She thought about the last real conversation she'd had with Sarah, 7 years ago. Sarah had called from grad school, voice tight with something Margaret couldn't quite name. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under, Mom. Everyone here. Their parents are doctors, lawyers, professors. They summer in the Hamptons. They have connections. I'm trying to build a life, and every time I talk about you, I feel like I have to explain. I have to justify." "Justify what?" Margaret had asked, though she'd already known the answer. "Nothing. Never mind. I have to go." That had been the last time they'd really talked. Everything after had been superficial, performative, the kind of communication that maintained the appearance of a relationship without requiring any of its substance. Until the letter, until the ticket, until now. The flight attendant came by again, offering dinner menus. Margaret stared at the options: seared salmon, braised short rib, vegetarian risotto, with the bewilderment of someone who usually ate canned soup and day-old bread. "The salmon is excellent," Mr. Westbrook said, not looking at her. "It might have been helpful if it hadn't sounded so much like an instruction." "Thank you," Margaret said. "I think I'll try the short rib, because maybe, just maybe, she was tired of taking the safe option. Maybe after 53 years of making herself small, of apologizing for existing, of accepting whatever scraps the world offered, she could claim this one small thing, a first-class seat, a meal she didn't have to cook. 4 hours where nobody needed her to clean anything, fix anything, be anything other than a woman on her way to see her daughter. The sky outside was darkening now, stars beginning to pierce through. Margaret pressed her hand against the window, feeling the cold through the plastic. Somewhere out there, hurtling toward her at 500 miles per hour, was whatever came next. The short rib came on white china with a gold rim, accompanied by roasted root vegetables arranged like a painting Margaret had once seen in a museum Sarah had dragged her to when she was 10. Margaret remembered that day clearly. The hushed galleries, the security guards eyeing them like they might steal the art, Sarah's wide-eyed wonder at the colors and shapes. They'd eaten peanut butter sandwiches on the museum steps afterward because the cafe prices had made Margaret's stomach hurt. That was before everything got complicated, before money became the unspoken gulf between what Margaret could provide and what Sarah needed to become. The meat dissolved on her tongue, rich and impossibly tender. She ate slowly, trying not to think about what this meal cost, trying not to calculate it against hours of work, gallons of floor cleaner, miles of baseboards scrubbed on hands and knees. First time flying first class? The question came from the woman in 3B, middle seat. She was maybe 40, with the kind of casual elegance that came from never having to think about price tags. Her sweater probably cost what Margaret made in a week. Margaret hesitated, then decided on honesty. First time flying at all. Oh. The woman's eyebrows rose, but her smile was genuine. Well, you picked a good route. Seattle's beautiful right now. Business or pleasure? My daughter's wedding. What? How wonderful. The woman's enthusiasm seemed real. I'm Emily, by the way. I'm actually heading to Seattle for a board meeting, but I'd much rather be going to a wedding. Is it a big affair? Margaret realized she had no idea. The invitation had been sparse on details. She didn't know the venue, the time, who else was invited, what she was supposed to wear. The only thing Sarah had specified was the date and, "Please come." "I'm not sure," Margaret admitted. "We haven't talked much recently." Emily's expression shifted, something knowing and sad crossing her features. "Ah, one of those relationships." "One of those," Margaret agreed. Across the aisle, Mr. Westbrook snorted softly, still pretending not to listen, while clearly listening to everything. Margaret felt a flash of irritation cut through her usual resignation. What gave him the right to judge? What did he know about the choices women like her had to make, the sacrifices that left scars no one else could see? But the anger faded as quickly as it came. She was too tired for rage, had been tired for so long that it had become her baseline state of being. Emily pulled out her phone, showing Margaret pictures of her own children, 2 boys, grinning in ski gear on a mountain Margaret didn't recognize. "They're with their father this week, divorced 3 years now." She said it matter-of-factly, without shame or apology. "Best decision I ever made, honestly. He was a good man, but we'd grown into different people." Margaret thought about Sarah's father, who hadn't been a good man, who'd drained their bank account and disappeared to avoid child support. She'd tracked him down once, years later, and found him living in Phoenix with a new family, new kids he actually stuck around for. That had hurt worse than his leaving. "Sarah, my daughter, she's marrying someone she met in grad school," Margaret offered. "I've never met him, don't even know his last name." The admission hung in the air between them. Emily didn't gasp or make sympathetic noises. She just nodded, like this was a perfectly reasonable thing to say. "Kids," Emily said. "They break your heart just by growing up." The flight attendant cleared their plates. Margaret excused herself to use the bathroom, navigating the aisle carefully, hyper-aware of her cheap shoes, her discount store clothes, the way she didn't quite move through the world with the confidence these other passengers radiated like cologne. The first-class bathroom was larger than her apartment's bathroom. There were actual hand towels, cloth, not paper, and lotion that smelled like lavender. Margaret stared at her reflection in the mirror under the soft lighting. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who worked with her hands, who'd aged faster than her years, who carried exhaustion in the set of her shoulders. Her hair was more grey than brown now, cut short because long hair took time and products she couldn't afford. Her skin was dry from constant exposure to cleaning chemicals. There were permanent grooves beside her mouth from years of pressing her lips together against things she wanted to say but didn't. This was the mother Sarah hadn't seen in 12 years. Not the young woman who'd held a newborn and promised her everything, but this, worn out, used up, barely holding on. Margaret washed her hands with the expensive soap and dried them on the cloth towel, folding it neatly afterward because someone would have to wash it, someone like her. And she knew what it meant to deal with other people's messes. When she returned to her seat, Mr. Westbrook was gone, probably in the other bathroom. Emily smiled at her. "Can I ask you something?" Emily said. "And you can tell me to mind my own business if you want." "Okay, what happened between you and your daughter?" Margaret sat down, refastened her seatbelt, even though the sign was off. Outside the window, there was nothing but darkness and the blinking red light on the wing. "I don't know if anything happened," she said slowly. "Not like a fight or a big argument. It was more like she outgrew me, like she got to a certain point in her life and realized I didn't fit anymore." "Did she say that?" "Not directly, but I could tell. The way she'd changed the subject when I asked about her life, how she stopped inviting me to visit, started being vague about holidays." Margaret's voice was steady, clinical, like she was describing someone else's pain. "I think she was ashamed of me. There, she'd said it. The truth she'd carried for years, wrapped up and buried deep where it couldn't hurt quite as much." Emily was quiet for a long moment. Then, "My mother grew up in rural Kentucky. Didn't graduate high school, married at 16, had me at 17. My father left when I was 5. She worked as a waitress at a truck stop for 30 years. Margaret glanced at her, this polished, educated woman in expensive clothes. I went to college on loans and scholarships, Emily continued. Got my MBA, built a career, and there was a period, God, I'm not proud of this, where I didn't want my colleagues to meet her, didn't want them to know where I came from. I'd make excuses about why she couldn't visit, why I was always too busy to go home. What changed? She got sick, ovarian cancer, and suddenly all the things I thought mattered, the image, the career, the perfect life I'd constructed, none of it meant a damn thing compared to the fact that I was going to lose her. Emily's eyes were bright. She went into remission, thank God. But it took almost losing her to realize that her pride in me was never conditional on me being ashamed of her. Margaret absorbed this, turning it over in her mind like a stone worn smooth by water. Sarah sent you a first-class ticket, Emily said. That's not nothing, that's her way of saying something she maybe doesn't have words for yet. Or it's guilt, Margaret said. An expensive gesture instead of an actual relationship. Maybe, or maybe you're both just scared. The word landed like a punch. Scared. Was that what this was? All these years, all this distance, was it fear on both sides? Sarah afraid of being pulled back into poverty, of being defined by where she came from, and Margaret afraid of... what? Reaching for her daughter and finding nothing there. Discovering that the girl she'd raised had truly, completely disappeared into someone else? Mr. Westbrook returned, settling back into his seat with his laptop. The flight attendant announced they'd begun their descent into Seattle. Margaret's stomach tightened. "Do you have a dress for the wedding?" Emily asked. Margaret shook her head. "I have a skirt and blouse. It's what I wear to church." Emily considered this. "What size are you?" I'm not sure. Medium? 10? I'm an 8. But I've got a dress in my suitcase that runs big. Got it for a garden party and never wore it because it wasn't quite my color. It's blue. Would look better on you anyway. You want it?" Margaret stared at her. "I couldn't." "You could. And you should. Consider it a gift from one mother to another." Emily pulled out her phone. "Give me your number. I'm staying at the Fairmont downtown. You can swing by and pick it up tomorrow if you want." "I can't afford the Fairmont," Margaret said quietly. "Where are you staying?" "There's a Motel 6 near the airport, $49 a night." Emily's expression flickered. Not pity. Exactly, but something close. "The dress offer stands. Text me when you're free." Margaret took Emily's number, fingers shaking slightly as she typed it into her flip phone. She hadn't expected kindness today, hadn't expected to meet someone who understood, who'd been where she was, who'd found a way through to the other side. The plane dropped lower. Seattle appeared below them, a sprawl of lights against the black water of Puget Sound, mountains invisible in the darkness, but Margaret knew they were there. She'd seen pictures, back when she'd helped Sarah research colleges, before Sarah had chosen Northwestern, before the distance had become geographic and then emotional and then seemingly permanent. "Thank you," Margaret said to Emily, "for the dress and for everything." "Don't thank me yet," Emily said with a small smile. "You still have to get through the wedding." The wheels touched down with a bump and a screech. The plane shuddered, slowed, and finally taxied to the gate. All around Margaret, people were standing, grabbing bags, checking phones, eager to get where they were going. Margaret stayed seated, heart hammering. This was it. Somewhere in this city, Sarah was real and close, and possibly willing to let Margaret back into her life. Or possibly this was goodbye with better production value. "Good luck," Emily said, squeezing Margaret's hand before disappearing into the crowd of deplaning passengers. Mr. Westbrook paused beside Margaret's seat. For a moment she thought he might apologize. might acknowledge his rudeness. Instead, he said, "Hope whatever you're running from works out," and then he was gone too. Running from. As if she'd ever had the luxury of running from anything. Margaret had spent her entire life running toward rent money, toward Sarah's needs, toward the next shift, the next day, the next impossible demand. She'd never had the option to run away. She gathered her bag and followed the stream of passengers off the plane. The jetway felt too narrow, the airport too bright and too busy. There were people everywhere, moving with purpose, while Margaret stood still, trying to remember how to breathe. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Mom, I'm outside baggage claim, blue jacket." Sarah, just like that. "No, I'm so glad you came." Or, "I've missed you." Just directions, practical and detached, as if they were strangers coordinating a pickup. Maybe they were. Margaret made her way through the terminal, past the shops selling Seattle souvenirs and overpriced coffee, past families reuniting with squeals and hugs, past business people barking into phones about meetings and markets. She found the escalator down to baggage claim, gripped the rubber handrail, and descended into whatever came next. Sarah was beautiful. That was Margaret's first thought when she spotted her daughter standing near Carousel 4, phone in hand, blue jacket, crisp and expensive looking. Sarah had always been pretty, but this was different, polished, professional. The kind of beauty that came with good health care, good nutrition, good sleep, and the absence of constant stress. Her hair was styled in a way that suggested regular salon visits. Her skin was clear. She stood with the posture of someone who'd never had to make herself small. Margaret's second thought was, "I don't know this person at all." Their eyes met across the baggage claim. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Sarah's face did something complicated, a flash of recognition, relief, something that might have been love or might have been obligation. It was too brief to pass, replaced quickly by a controlled, cautious smile. She walked toward Margaret, not running, not rushing, just walking, like they were professional colleagues meeting for the first time. "You came," Sarah said when she reached her mother. "You asked me to." They stood 3 feet apart, an ocean of unsaid things between them. Margaret wanted to pull her daughter into her arms, to press her face into Sarah's hair, the way she had when Sarah was small and sick or scared or sad. But Sarah's body language was closed, professional, and Margaret had learned to read the signals that meant "don't touch me." "How was the flight?" Sarah asked. "It was fine. First classes. Very nice. Thank you for that." "I wanted you to be comfortable." Comfortable. As if comfort was what Margaret had been missing all these years, rather than her daughter's voice, her daughter's laughter, her daughter's presence in her life. "Do you have bags to check?" Sarah asked, looking past Margaret toward the carousel. "Just this." Margaret held up her canvas bag. Something flickered in Sarah's expression. Was it shame, pity, disappointment that her mother still traveled with everything she owned in a single bag? But again, it passed too quickly to be sure. "Okay, my car's in short-term parking. This way." They walked through the airport in silence. Margaret tried to think of things to say, questions to ask, but everything felt either too big or too small. "How have you been seemed inadequate for 12 years? I missed you felt like an accusation. Why did you stop loving me was too raw, too desperate, too true." So she said nothing, just followed Sarah through the automatic doors into the wet Seattle night. It was raining, of course it was raining. A fine mist that felt more like walking through a cloud than any rain Margaret knew from Texas. The air smelled like pine and salt water, and something else, something green and alive. Sarah's car was a silver Audi, 3 years old maybe, well maintained. The kind of car that said, "I've made it," without screaming it. She unlocked it with a key fob, and Margaret climbed into the passenger seat, which adjusted automatically with a soft hum. "It's about 20 minutes to my place," Sarah said, starting the engine. "I thought you could stay with me instead of a motel. I have a guest room." It wasn't really an offer, more like a statement of fact. Margaret thought about the Motel 6 reservation she'd made, the $49 she'd budgeted so carefully. "Are you sure? I don't want to impose—" "Mom! You flew across the country. You're staying with me." There was an edge to Sarah's voice, the first crack in her controlled demeanor. She pulled out of the parking spot too fast, had to brake sharply for a pedestrian, and muttered sorry to no one in particular. They merged onto I-5, rain streaking the windows, the city lights blurring into watercolor smudges. Margaret watched the highway signs, Tacoma, Portland, places she'd only seen on maps. Everything felt foreign and temporary, like she was living inside someone else's life. "Tell me about him," Margaret said finally. "Your fiancé." Sarah's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "His name is David Chen. We met in grad school. He was getting his MBA while I was doing my doctorate in economics. He's from San Francisco, works in venture capital now." Doctorate, venture capital. These were words from a world Margaret barely understood, a vocabulary of success she'd never learned to speak. "What's he like?" Margaret pressed. "He's kind, smart. He makes me laugh. His parents are nice. They're actually flying in from California tomorrow." Sarah paused, signaling to change lanes. "They're excited to meet you." The unspoken corollary hung in the air, unlike Sarah, who seemed more anxious than excited. "And you?" Margaret asked. "What do you do now?" "I'm a policy analyst for a think tank. We focus on economic inequality, ironically enough." Sarah's laugh was bitter, self-aware. "I spend my days writing papers about poverty while living in a condo that costs more per month than you probably make in 6. There it was. The thing neither of them had said directly, finally spoken aloud. The gap between them, measured not in miles or years, but in dollar signs and opportunities and choices that had led them to completely different Americas. "I'm proud of you," Margaret said quietly. "I know I haven't said it enough, or maybe at all recently, but I'm so proud of who you've become." Sarah's jaw tightened. Don't what? Don't make this easy. Don't be understanding and proud, and don't let me off the hook." Sarah's voice cracked. "I cut you out of my life, Mom. I was ashamed of you. I told my friends you were busy, that we weren't close, that you lived far away. I let them think you were. I don't know, dead or absent, or just not someone worth mentioning." The rain was falling harder now, the wipers struggling to keep up. Sarah took an exit, turned onto a tree-lined street, where the houses got progressively larger, more expensive, more impossible. "And the worst part," Sarah continued, "is that I told myself it was necessary, that I needed to establish my own identity, separate from where I came from, that it was healthy boundaries or self-preservation or whatever bullshit I could come up with, to justify the fact that I abandoned you." Margaret felt tears burning behind her eyes but blinked them back. "You didn't abandon me. You built a life. By erasing you from it." They pulled into a parking garage beneath a modern building, all glass and steel and clean lines. Sarah parked in a spot marked with her unit number, killed the engine, and sat there gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "I started therapy 6 months ago," she said to the dashboard. "David suggested it because I kept having panic attacks about the wedding. And the therapist, she kept asking about my family, about my childhood. And I realized I'd constructed this entire adult life on a foundation of lies. Not big lies, just omissions, revisions. A carefully edited version of reality that left out everything inconvenient. Like me," Margaret said. "Like you." Sarah turned to look at her mother for the first time since they'd gotten in the car. Her eyes were red, her carefully applied makeup starting to smudge. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know if I can. But David said the only thing worse than having you at the wedding would be not having you there and regretting it forever." Margaret reached over slowly, giving Sarah time to pull away. When she didn't, Margaret took her daughter's hand. It was soft, uncalloused. The hand of someone who'd never had to scrub floors or wash dishes until the skin cracked. But it was still Sarah's hand, still recognizable after all these years. "Tell me what you need," Margaret said. "From this visit, from the wedding, from me. Tell me what you need and I'll try to give it to you." Sarah pulled her hand back, wiped her eyes. "I need you to meet David and not hate him for being rich. I need you to meet his parents and not feel judged, even though you probably will be. I need you to stand up at this wedding and be my mom, even though I haven't let you be my mom in over a decade." She took a shaky breath. "And I need you to understand that I love you and resent you and feel guilty about you all at the same time. And I don't know how to untangle any of it." The honesty was brutal and necessary. Margaret felt it like a blade, clean and sharp, cutting through years of pretense. "Okay," she said simply. "Okay. I can do those things, except the understanding part. I already understand that. You're allowed to have complicated feelings about me, Sarah. God knows I have complicated feelings about being your mother." They got out of the car, took the elevator to the 5th floor. Sarah's condo was modern and minimalist. All white walls and hardwood floors and furniture that looked uncomfortable, but probably cost a fortune. There were framed degrees on the wall, bachelor's from Northwestern, PhD from Chicago. There were plants, alive and thriving, which seemed impossible to Margaret, who'd never been able to keep anything green from dying. "Guest rooms down the hall," Sarah said, switching on lights. "Bathrooms next to it. There are towels in the cabinet. Are you hungry?" "I ate on the plane." "Right, the first-class meal." Sarah said it without malice, just acknowledgement of the absurdity that Margaret's first decent meal in recent memory had come from an airline. Margaret set her bag down in the guest room, which was larger than her entire efficiency apartment. There was a real bed with a headboard, nightstands with actual lamps, curtains that matched the bedspread. It looked like a hotel room, impersonal but expensive. She found Sarah in the kitchen, pouring wine from a bottle that probably cost more than Margaret spent on groceries in a month. "Want some?" Sarah offered. "Sure." They sat at the breakfast bar, two women who looked similar around the eyes and mouth but were otherwise strangers, sipping wine and avoiding eye contact. "David wants to meet you tomorrow," Sarah said. "Dinner at his parents' hotel. It's going to be a lot. His mother is very—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Particular. Everything has to be perfect. The wedding is going to be huge, 200 people, most of them David's family's business associates." Margaret imagined it, a ballroom full of people in expensive clothes, eating food she wouldn't recognize, speaking a language of privilege she'd never learned. And her, the cleaning lady from Detroit, sitting there in Emily's borrowed dress, trying not to embarrass her daughter. "I'll be fine," Margaret said, though she wasn't sure if that was true. "His parents don't know," Sarah blurted out. "About you, I mean. They know I have a mother, obviously, but they think. I let them assume things. That you're a teacher or a nurse or something respectable. I didn't correct them." Margaret set down her wine glass carefully. "What am I going to say if they ask what I do?" "Tell them the truth," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm done lying. That's the whole point of this, isn't it? To stop pretending to be someone I'm not, which requires admitting where I actually came from. And if they judge you for it, then David will deal with it. He knows everything now. I told him last month the whole truth, that my mom cleans houses, that I grew up poor, that I've been ashamed of it my entire adult life. And you know what he said?" Sarah's laugh was watery. "He said it explained a lot about why I work so hard to prove myself. He wasn't disgusted. He was just sad. Sad that I'd carried that shame alone for so long." Margaret thought about this man she'd never met, who'd apparently seen past Sarah's carefully constructed facade to the hurt underneath. He sounds like a good person. He is. Better than I deserve, probably. Don't say that. It's true, though, isn't it? Sarah refilled her wineglass. I abandoned the one person who loved me unconditionally so I could build a life with people who only loved the version of me I was willing to show them. That's not something a good person does. Margaret wanted to argue, to tell Sarah she was being too hard on herself, but maybe this was what Sarah needed, to sit with the guilt, to feel the full weight of her choices, to understand that love wasn't always enough to bridge the gaps people created. You were so young, Margaret said instead. When you left, you were 18, barely an adult, and I'd raised you to reach for more, to want more. How could I blame you for taking the path I'd pushed you toward? You pushed me toward college, not toward cutting you out of my life. No, but I taught you that where we came from was something to escape. Every time I worked 2 jobs, every time I screwed up my face looking at prices, every time I apologized for what I couldn't afford, I was teaching you that poverty was shameful, that we were less than, so when you got the chance to be more, to have more, you took it, even if it meant leaving me behind. Sarah was crying now. Not prettily, but in the raw, gasping way of someone who'd been holding back for too long. Margaret wanted to comfort her, but didn't know how anymore, didn't know if she had the right after so much distance. I'm sorry, Sarah said through her tears. I'm so sorry, Mom. I know, baby, I know. They sat there in Sarah's expensive kitchen, the rain still falling outside, the city lights blurring through the tiers and the windows. Somewhere in this same city, David Chen was probably sleeping peacefully, unaware that his future mother-in-law was currently watching her daughter fall apart. Tomorrow, Margaret would meet him, would meet his parents, would navigate a world she didn't understand and try not to drown in it. But tonight, in this moment, she just sat with her daughter and let her cry. The dress Emily had given her was exactly the right shade of blue, not bright enough to draw attention, not dark enough to look funereal. It fit well enough if Margaret didn't breathe too deeply, and the modest neckline meant she didn't have to worry about looking inappropriate. She'd picked it up that morning from Emily's hotel, had caught a bus across the city because she couldn't afford the Uber. Emily had insisted on throwing in a pair of shoes too, claiming they'd never fit her right. They were only half a size too big, and Margaret stuffed tissue in the toes. Now she stood in Sarah's guest bathroom, staring at herself in the mirror, trying to recognize the woman reflected back. Sarah had offered to do her makeup, and for once Margaret had accepted, letting her daughter paint on primer and foundation and blush, creating cheekbones where exhaustion usually lived. You look beautiful, Sarah said, standing in the doorway. She was already dressed for dinner in a black sheathed dress that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly rent. Her engagement ring caught the light, a diamond so large it seemed almost satirical. I look like I'm playing dress-up, Margaret said. No, you look like yourself, just polished. They took Sarah's Audi downtown to the Four Seasons, where David's parents were staying. Margaret's stomach churned the entire drive. Sarah had briefed her over breakfast. David's father owned a chain of upscale restaurants in San Francisco. His mother came from old money. They were expecting a certain level of sophistication from their son's choice of bride. What if I use the wrong fork? Margaret had asked, only half joking. There's no wrong fork, Mom. And if anyone makes you feel bad about not knowing something, they're the one with the problem, not you. Easy to say. Harder to believe when you'd spent 53 years being reminded of everything you didn't know, couldn't afford, would never be. The Four Seasons lobby was all marble and chandeliers, the kind of place where Margaret would normally be pushing a cleaning cart, not walking through as a guest. She felt the security guard's eyes on her, the doorman's subtle assessment. People who looked like her didn't usually come through the front entrance. David was waiting in the lobby, and Margaret recognized him immediately. Not from pictures, because Sarah had never sent any, but from the way he lit up when he saw Sarah, the genuine warmth in his smile. He was handsome in an understated way, wearing a suit that fit perfectly, his black hair styled neatly. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, extending his hand, "it's so good to finally meet you. Sarah's told me so much about you." Margaret doubted that, but shook his hand anyway. "Please call me Margaret, and congratulations." "Thank you. I'm the luckiest man alive." He looked at Sarah with such open affection that Margaret felt something in her chest loosen. Whatever else was true, this man clearly loved her daughter. They took the elevator to the top-floor restaurant, and Margaret's ears popped with the pressure change. The restaurant was all windows, offering a panoramic view of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains beyond. The sun was setting, painting everything gold and rose. David's parents were already seated at a table by the window. His father stood as they approached, tall, graying, with the kind of confidence that came from never having to prove anything. His mother remained seated, her posture so perfect it looked painful. She wore pearls and the expression that could have meant anything. "Mom, Dad, this is Margaret Holloway, Sarah's mother," David said. "Margaret, these are my parents, James and Patricia Chen." "Mrs. Holloway, what a pleasure," James said, shaking her hand with the firm grip of a businessman. "Please sit." Margaret sat, acutely aware of how her borrowed dress suddenly felt cheap, how her home-done manicure couldn't hide years of rough work, how her accent marked her as someone from the other America, the one people like this probably never thought about. "So lovely to meet you," Patricia said, her smile precise and controlled. "Sarah has been quite mysterious about her family. We're delighted to finally put a face to the name." The implication was clear. Why had Sarah hidden her mother? What was she hiding? "I've been eager to meet you as well," Margaret said, which wasn't exactly true but seemed like the right thing to say. A waiter appeared with menus that had no prices listed. Margaret's panic must have shown because Sarah leaned over and whispered, "Order whatever you want. David's parents are treating." The menu was in French, or maybe it was just pretentious English. Margaret recognized maybe 3 items: scallops, lamb, risotto. Everything else was a mystery wrapped in culinary terminology. "The scallops here are magnificent," Patricia said, "though the lamb is also excellent if you prefer meat." Margaret ordered the scallops, figuring it was safer to take the suggestion than risk ordering something she couldn't pronounce. "So, Margaret," James said once they'd ordered, "Sarah tells us you live in Detroit. What brings you to that part of the country?" "Work, mostly," Margaret said carefully. "I moved there about 15 years ago for better opportunities. And what is it you do?" Here it was, the moment of truth. Sarah was watching her, David was watching her, and Patricia was watching her with the sharp attention of someone cataloguing every detail for later dissection. Margaret thought about lying, could claim she was a teacher like Sarah had let them believe, or a nurse, or anything other than what she actually was. But she'd spent her whole life lying through omission, making herself smaller, more palatable, less embarrassing. And where had it gotten her? A daughter who'd erased her from her own life story. "I'm a housekeeper," Margaret said clearly. "I work for a cleaning service. Have for 27 years. The silence that followed lasted only seconds but felt eternal. Patricia's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, surprise maybe, or vindication of whatever assumptions she'd already made. "How honest," Patricia said, which could have meant anything. "It's honest work," Margaret replied, meeting her gaze steadily. "I raised my daughter on that work, put food on our table, kept a roof over our heads, helped pay for books and school supplies. I'm not ashamed of it." "Nor should you be," James said quickly, shooting his wife a look. "All honest work is honorable work." "Indeed," Patricia murmured, taking a delicate sip of her wine. David jumped in, steering the conversation toward wedding logistics. The ceremony would be Saturday at the Seattle Art Museum, the reception at a nearby hotel, 200 guests, a jazz quartet for the ceremony, and a full band for the dancing. Margaret listened, trying to imagine herself in that setting, surrounded by 200 people who lived in a different stratosphere of existence. "And you'll be walking Sarah down the aisle?" Patricia asked, almost as an afterthought. Margaret hadn't thought about this. Traditionally, fathers walked daughters down the aisle, but Sarah had no father, not really. The question hung there, awkward and loaded. "If Sarah wants me to," Margaret said. "I do," Sarah said firmly. "David's dad will walk with his mum, and you'll walk with me. If that's okay with you." "Of course it is." The food arrived, and Margaret had never seen scallops like this. Perfectly seared, arranged artfully with vegetables she didn't recognize, drizzled with a sauce that probably had a French name. She cut into one carefully, aware of everyone watching, aware that she was being evaluated with every bite. It was delicious, although she would have been just as happy with the canned soup she usually ate for dinner. Patricia dominated the conversation, discussing the wedding arrangements with the authority of a general planning a military campaign. The flowers, the seating chart, the photographer, the menu for the reception, everything had been debated, selected, perfected. Sarah mostly nodded along, occasionally offering opinions that Patricia would consider and often override. "Your dress is lovely, by the way," Patricia said to Margaret during a lull in the wedding talk. "Is it new?" "Borrowed," Margaret said. "From a friend I met on the plane." How resourceful. Again, that word that could mean anything. Margaret excused herself to the restroom, needing a moment away from Patricia's assessing gaze and the weight of trying to be acceptable. The bathroom was as lavish as everything else, all marble and gold fixtures and lighting that somehow made everyone look better. She was washing her hands when Patricia entered. "Margaret," Patricia said, standing at the adjacent sink but not washing her hands, just watching Margaret in the mirror. "May I be frank with you?" Margaret's stomach dropped, but she kept her face neutral. "Of course." "I'm concerned," Patricia said, "that the disparity between your background and ours might create tension. Not for James and me, you understand, but for Sarah and David. They're building a life in a certain social circle, and appearances do matter, whether we like it or not." There it was. The thing she'd been waiting for, delivered with all the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "I see," Margaret said carefully. "I'm not saying this to hurt you," Patricia continued, her tone almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "I'm sure you're a wonderful person, and you clearly raised a remarkable daughter. But Sarah has worked very hard to build a certain image, a certain reputation, and David's career requires a certain level of social finesse. I just want to make sure everyone is comfortable." Margaret dried her hands slowly, buying time to choose her words. She could be diplomatic, could nod and smile and promise to stay out of the way, to be as invisible as possible, to not embarrass anyone. But she thought about Sarah crying in her expensive kitchen, drowning in guilt and shame. Thought about David, who'd apparently loved Sarah enough to accept the truth of where she came from. Thought about Emily on the plane, who'd built a successful life and still loved her waitress mother without apology. "Mrs. Chen," Margaret said, turning to face her directly, "I appreciate your concern, but let me be frank with you as well. I'm not here to infiltrate your social circle or embarrass my daughter. I'm here because she invited me after 12 years of barely speaking. And yes, I'm a housekeeper. I've scrubbed toilets probably nicer than the one in this bathroom. I shop at thrift stores and take the bus because I can't afford a car. I'm everything you're worried about. Proof that not everyone at this wedding comes from money and privilege." Patricia's eyes widened slightly, but Margaret continued. "But here's what else I am. I'm the woman who raised that remarkable daughter you mentioned, who worked 2 jobs so she could focus on school, who taught her that your worth isn't measured by your bank account, but by your character, who loved her enough to let her go when she needed to fly away, even when it broke my heart. Margaret's voice was steady, strong. So, if my presence makes people uncomfortable, that's their problem, not mine. I didn't raise my daughter to be ashamed of where she came from, even though she was for a while. And I'm not going to help perpetuate that shame by making myself smaller or quieter or more convenient. Patricia stared at her for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled. A real smile, not the practiced one from dinner. "Well," she said, "I see where Sarah gets her spine from." They returned to the table, where dessert had arrived, some kind of chocolate construction that looked more like architecture than food. Sarah caught Margaret's eye, a question in her expression, but Margaret just smiled and picked up her dessert fork. The rest of the dinner passed in easier conversation. James told stories about David as a child, Sarah shared a few carefully edited memories of her own childhood, and Margaret even laughed at a joke about the Seattle rain. Patricia remained watchful, but less hostile, as if Margaret had passed some test she hadn't known she was taking. When they said their goodbyes in the lobby, James shook Margaret's hand warmly. "We're happy to have you as part of the family, Margaret, truly." Patricia offered her hand as well. "I look forward to seeing you at the wedding," she said, and this time there seemed to be genuine warmth behind it. In the car, Sarah was quiet for a long time. Then, "What did Patricia say to you in the bathroom?" "She wanted to make sure I knew my place," Margaret said, "so I showed her." Sarah laughed, a surprised burst of sound. "Oh my God, you're terrifying. I'm your mother. It's my job to be terrifying when necessary." They drove through the rainy Seattle streets, and Margaret looked out at the city that was both foreign and increasingly familiar. Tomorrow was the rehearsal dinner, and Saturday was the wedding, the culmination of this strange journey from a first-class plane seat to reconciliation with a daughter she'd lost and found again. "I'm still angry at you," Sarah said suddenly, "for not fighting harder to stay in my life, for accepting my excuses and my distance instead of calling me out." "I know. But I'm also grateful that you came, that you're willing to try again." "We're both trying," Margaret said. "That's what matters." When they got back to Sarah's condo, Margaret found a gift bag sitting on the guest room bed. Inside was a jewelry box, and inside that was a delicate silver bracelet with a single charm. A tiny house. The note read, "Something borrowed, something blue, something old, something new. The dress is borrowed. Your shoes are blue. I'm the old. This bracelet is new. Thank you for being brave enough to show up." Emily Margaret fastened it around her wrist, the metal cool against her skin. Tomorrow she'd stand beside her daughter at a rehearsal dinner, and Saturday she'd walk her down the aisle in front of 200 witnesses to a life Margaret would never fully be part of, but would always support from the edges. It wasn't the ending she would have written, but maybe it was the beginning of something better, imperfect, complicated, real. She thought about the man on the plane, Mr. Westbrook, who'd looked at her and seen someone who didn't belong. He'd been right in a way. She didn't belong in first class, didn't belong in 5-star restaurants, didn't belong in the world Sarah had built. But she belonged to Sarah. And Sarah, despite everything, still belonged to her. That would have to be enough. The wedding was beautiful in the way expensive things often are. Perfect flowers, perfect music, perfect lighting in the Seattle Art Museum's Grand Hall. Margaret walked Sarah down the aisle in Emily's blue dress and the bracelet that caught the light with every step. Sarah's hand trembled in hers, and Margaret squeezed it gently, a reminder that she was there. She was real. She was staying. When the officiant asked who gave this woman to be married, Margaret said, "I do," in a voice that carried to the back row, where Emily sat smiling, having insisted on attending despite being a stranger to everyone but Margaret. At the reception, Margaret danced with Sarah to a song she didn't recognize, and later with David, who thanked her for raising such an amazing woman. Patricia Chen even sought her out, offering a genuine compliment on her dress and asking about her flight home. "Tomorrow," Margaret said. "Back to Detroit. Back to work on Monday." "Will you visit?" Patricia asked. "They're moving to San Francisco, you know, David's job." "If I'm invited," Margaret said. "You're invited," Sarah said, appearing beside them with champagne. "Every holiday, every birthday, whenever you want, no more disappearing." "Deal," Margaret said. That night, lying in Sarah's guest room for the last time, Margaret thought about the journey. Not just the flight from Detroit to Seattle, but the longer one from poverty to pride, from shame to acceptance, from loss to tentative recovery. In the morning, Sarah drove her to the airport. They said goodbye at the curb, a real hug this time, long and tight. "I love you, Mom," Sarah said. "I should have said it more, should have shown it better, but I love you. I love you too, baby. Always have. Always will." Margaret went through security, through the terminal, onto another plane, this time in economy, which was fine because she knew now that where you sat didn't determine your worth. The plane took off, and Seattle grew small below her. But unlike the first flight, when everything had felt precarious and uncertain, this time Margaret felt grounded even as she flew. She was going home to her efficiency apartment, her cleaning job, her small life. But it was bigger now somehow, expanded by the knowledge that she had a daughter who was trying, a son-in-law who was kind, and a future that held more than just endless work and endless loneliness. It wasn't a fairy tale. There would be setbacks, misunderstandings, moments when the distance felt too great to bridge, but they would try, both of them would try. And sometimes, Margaret thought as the plane leveled off above the clouds, trying was the bravest thing you could do,